This is Football at 4.
Josh Hennick filling in for Mike Gill here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. Yes, Football at 4 is here. We continue the football conversation as we are counting down the days to Eagles training camp. And Geoff Mosher joins us as does each Wednesday here on 97.3 ESPN. Jeff, welcome in. How you doing, my friend?
I'm great, Josh. It is just so hot that I'm happy to be inside in an air conditioning room, just like yourself, talking to you. And this could be a great interview if you promise not to ask me if insert Eagle here is a top 5 player at his position.
Well, I wasn't going to ask you that. So
Good. What the great day continues.
Is it okay if I ask you about the Hard Knocks last night?
Only if you want to talk to somebody who didn't watch it.
Well, I didn't watch it either, but I saw the online clips. You know, I just don't understand, Jeff, how this Giants organization seemed to have no clue. This is now 3 straight episodes where they had no clue the Eagles were interested. Like, how? And then he's telling the agent last night. He's saying to him, "Well, can you tell me who it is? Who's giving? Is it like he's begging for information from the agent?" And it's like, dude, like you're the one who told him to go check out the market, and now you're surprised that he's leaving. Like, I don't understand. Like, Jeff, I get it. I know why Saquon left, because Saquon was like, this team in the Eagles wants me and knows how to use me, and the Giants are like, we would like you back. Like, it's just such a contrast.
Yeah, and I wonder a lot about, Josh, how Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, right, had to sort of navigate what appears to me to be the concept of once they didn't come to a long-term agreement with him the year before, right, and he played on that final year, it appeared to me that they had moved on from him for the future. But as you saw in Hard Knocks, and even me not seeing it can't avoid all of the memes and the Twitter clips or X clips of the owner really wanting to be, involved and know what's going on with Saquon Barkley, and even insinuating that if Saquon Barkley left for the Eagles, he would just melt, right? But I don't think that bothers Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll as much as it bothered the owner. But the owner, as we even know here in Philadelphia, is the guy that you're ultimately trying to win over and convince to keep your job. So I think that was a difficult navigation. I honestly don't think – I think if you shot Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll with True Serum, they would tell you they're not that upset that Saquon Barkley's not a Giant. I'm not saying that they don't think he was a good weapon, but I think for what they want to do, what they want to become, for all the injuries that they had to deal with Saquon there, I'm a little bit surprised that their best backup plan was Devin Singletary. I mean, we know that was Brian Daboll's guy from Buffalo, but that surprises me. But I don't think that they want to be that invested in a position that eventually, when they get to where they want to be, if they get the chance to get there, they're probably not going to be running the ball or having a running back touch the ball 18 to 25 times. So I think that was a difficult navigation for them between what they want to do and what the owner wanted.
So with that being said, Jeff, when you look at Saquon now with the Eagles, what is a realistic expectation? Not the fans who want to place a bet or the fantasy football people out there. I mean, like, what is a legitimate, your perspective on everything you know about this coaching staff and Saquon and how this might play out?
Yeah, Josh, it's a great question. Not 100% sure. Obviously when you pay him that kind of money, you want a guy who's going to give you, I don't want to come up with a number, but yeah, they probably want something like 1,600 combined yards and, whether that's 1,200 rushing, 400 receiving, right? And double-digit touchdowns. But I don't even want to put it into stats for them. I think they want an impact player. They obviously want an impact player, and they're paying for an impact player at that position. 2 years ago, Kellen Moore had Tony Pollard, who was sort of splitting time with Ezekiel Elliott, but he obviously had a ton of carries, made the Pro Bowl. He had 1,378 yards that year combined, 12 touchdowns. And that was on a low price, right? Because that was like year 3 of his rookie deal. So is that a reasonable expectation? I I don't know how you can expect all that production and also expect 1,400 yards again out of A.J. Brown and 1,200 yards out of Devontae Smith and 1,000 out of Dallas Goedert. So the expectation is the Eagles had a lot of money. They went out and used that money to make their offense as well-rounded as possible. And I think that the Eagles themselves don't even want to put a number on it. They just want it all to work well and be harmonious with an explosive run game and an explosive pass game.
Which leads me into the latest edition of the Inside the Birds podcast. You and Adam talked about who the coaching staff is. And I think it's important that people look at Kellen Moore and probably just look at him as the former Cowboys offensive coordinator. But his influences are way beyond the Cowboys specifically because he has Scott Linehan in his lineage. And Linehan comes from Mike Martz, and Mike Martz ran the greatest show on turf. Now, I'm not saying the Eagles will be the greatest show at the Link, but what I'm wondering from you, Geoff, is there for you any connectivity down that line?
Oh, there's a lot of connectivity, Josh. I'm glad you brought that up. This is one of my favorite podcast series that we do, where we take a really in-depth examination into the coaching staffs. And tomorrow we'll do the defensive one that will come out with Vic Fangio and his staff. But we don't just talk about what their schemes are. I mean, I don't want to say it's been beaten to death. We've done that. But we also talk about their influences, what their expectations is, how they've adapted, what the metrics say they do. And as far as influences, yes, Scott Linehan not only was an influence and is an influence on the offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, but in 3 different places, he's also worked with quarterback Doug Nussmeier, quarterback's coach Doug Nussmeier, who, by the way, was a quarterback at Idaho when Scott Linehan was the head coach there. So they have that's a lot. There's a lot of symmetry there. As you mentioned, he was always known, Scott Linehan, as an attack style offensive coordinator. Unfortunately for him, when he became the Rams head coach after Mike Martz years later, he did not inherit Kurt Warner and Marshall Faulk and all those guys. He wound up with Mark Bolger and Steven Jackson, but he still produced, I think, a top 10 offense in his first year as the Rams head coach, and Steven Jackson did flourish underneath him. So that's Scott Linehan. So fast forward to his influences here, or who he's influenced, being Nussmeier and Scott and Kellen Moore. What you would expect, you're going to see spread offense, attack offense, mismatches. We've seen motion involved in the offense before. Now, here's a really fascinating thing that we have found out, and Greg Cosell even mentioned it too. Greg knew this from his interactions also with the Eagles, is that Jeff Stoutland, who is the run game coordinator, not the biggest fan of motion. And here you have an offensive coordinator who has been given, autonomy, full autonomy all offense, who is normally incorporated motion into the offense. So it'll be interesting, Josh, to see how that works out when such a renowned coach like Jeff Stoutland, who's been here for a while, doesn't love motion, but the offensive coordinator who's responsible for making this offense work does like motion.
Talk with Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com, and subscribe to Inside the Birds as well on YouTube at Geoff P. Mosher on Twitter X. You mentioned about Stoutland. That's a fascinating question I want to follow up with you because, you can run motion, but maybe not as much to offend the other guy, right? There usually, at least from my understanding, I was listening to Nick Saban talk about this the other day, and I know Stoutland is from Alabama at one point, so that's why I'm thinking of it. Saban talked about how, you have to balance everybody's interests as a coach, and you have to understand that, because remember, Saban had that period where he had a different offensive coordinator every single year, it seemed
Correct.
like. And, Saban talked about how, you got to understand that, just because Steve Sarkisian likes this, but maybe you don't have a quarterback who's good at that, or you maybe have a running back coach whose expertise is one type of running back, but maybe you can't recruit that guy. So Saban talked about how you got to make all the pieces fit, and sometimes you got to do a little bit of compromising. So I'm assuming that maybe there might be a little compromising then between Stoutland and Kellen Moore here.
Yeah, and I love the example you're bringing up in Nick Saban because it's really pertinent to the Eagles, because Jeff Stoutland worked for Nick Saban before Chip Kelly brought him to Philadelphia. And back then, Josh, when Nick Saban was the coach and Jeff Stoutland was the offensive coordinator, Alabama's offense was not what it eventually has become. Alabama's offense was way more pro style. Like you said, less motion. It was based on the running back more, the running game. Trent Richardson, who's the other guy? Yeldon, was he an Alabama running back?
TJ Yeldon, yes, he was.
Yeah. Derrick Henry, right? I mean, they had these big
Bo Scarborough.
Yes. And to your point, the offensive coordinators back then fell in line with that. And it wasn't really until Lane Kiffin got to Alabama and butted heads at times with Nick. And so credit Nick Saban for bringing in a guy who thought differently. And Lane said, look, we got to get with the times. We got to run more spread. We got to open it up. And lo and behold, Alabama went from the running game to all of a sudden flourishing in the pass game. And then look what that did for Alabama. Julio Jones and Jerry Jeudy and all the Amari Cooper, right? All the great wide receivers that have Devontae Smith have come out of Alabama lately is a direct result of the fact that Nick Saban compromised and started throwing the ball. All right, now he didn't deviate. He wasn't like air raid. He's not, rest in peace, Mike Leach, but he was willing to see a different side and the benefits of a different way of doing it offensively. And that's what you have to hope here happens between Kellen Moore and Jeff Stoutland. They do seem to be like two guys who are not egomaniacs. I think that's important. I mean, I don't know them very well, but I've talked to Jeff Stoutland a lot. I don't think he doesn't strike me as an egomaniac. And you can, of course, incorporate more motion in your passing game, which Jeff Stoutland is not in charge of, as opposed to the running game where maybe you don't need it. The Eagles aren't a wide zone type of team anyway. They're more of an inside zone. And I think if Kellen Moore is smart, he's going to keep that up with how big their offensive line is. Just pound it up the middle, run duo, run inside zone. You don't have to worry about guys running orbit motion and jet motion and shifting and moving tight ends. You're just going to pound the rock up the middle because that's where the Eagles have done most of their damage in the running game. So, yes, I don't think that it takes a whole lot of compromise here to make this work.
And sticking with the offensive line, we know that Lane Johnson had the best run block ratio in all the NFL last year, not just tackles, all offensive linemen. So I'm assuming that we're not going to just see 5 wide spreads and crazy stuff, because Kellen Moore did have a top 10 rushing offense in Dallas 3 or 4 years. So, I'm assuming that we are going to still see a little smash mouth going on here in Philadelphia. It's not just going to be, throwing the ball deep every down.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there have been times over the last 2 to 3 years where the Eagles have really flexed their muscle. You think about the Saints when they had the number 1 run defense and number 1 overall defense. They came into the link, and the Eagles, this was like 2 years ago, right? Super Bowl year, or maybe even before that. The Eagles ran all over them.
Yeah.
The Jacksonville game where it was pouring and the Eagles just decided to run. The Minnesota game, not last year, but the year before. Or no, maybe it was last year. I get them all mixed up now where Brian Flores went with the light box and the Eagles just ran up the middle. I guess that was 2 years ago, right? Or no, last year, right? So there are absolutely times where I'm sure Kellen Moore will say, all right, this team is trying to stop our passing weapons. They're playing a lot of 2 deep zones, a lot of quarters coverage, a lot of defensive backs are back. So let's get the ball to Saquon Barkley, and that's where all that money comes in, right? And you just hope Saquon Barkley stays healthy and can operate behind. Obviously, you should be able to operate behind this really good offensive line.
Yeah, and before I let you go, Jeff, I was doing a little research because if you compare Hurts and Dak Prescott, for example, Prescott has thrown the ball 269 more times in his last 50 starts than Jalen Hurts. Yeah. But the Eagles have an offensive line that can run the ball. So it would be dumb if you tell Lane Johnson and Jordan Mailata and Landon Dickerson, you guys are really good at run blocking, but we're not going to run the ball so we can have Jalen throw the ball more. Like, it only makes sense to say, let's run the ball to offset what we're doing, because we know the Eagles want to pass. We know that's what Jeffrey Lurie loves, right, Jeff? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, sometimes if you look around, you're like, oh, they're daring us, so we got Saquon. You don't.
Yeah, you can look at that. I mean, I also think that, Dallas throws the ball more. They have a great offensive line, too. They have had a great offensive line throughout the years and a lot of Pro Bowlers. But, Dak Prescott, the reason why he's thrown the ball a lot more is because he's a good thrower of the football, despite what a lot of Eagles fans might want to say about Dak Prescott. He's, if he's not, he may not be top 3, but he's in that top 5, 6, 7 names of guys who can really hurt you through the air. And so they've wanted to throw the football because they have Dak Prescott.
Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. Like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The next pod drops tomorrow, right, Geoff?
It does. That'll be the defensive examination of the defensive coaching staff. Totally different if you think about it, because when we talk about coordinators, whether it's Kellen Moore, whether it was last year when we were doing Jonathan Gannon or Shane Steichen 2 years ago, right, or when we were doing Sean Desai, we always talk about who's influenced them and why they do what they do. Well, when we talk about Vic Fangio and a lot of the disciples on our staff, he is the influencer, right? Like there's his two influences who we will talk about on the podcast. They're not in coaching anymore, and they haven't been coaching for quite a while. And oh, by the way, Vic Fangio changed his own concepts about 5 or 6, 7 years ago to do something different than even he was doing, say, when he was with the 49ers with Harbaugh and went to the Super Bowl. He has adapted for a reason that we get into on the podcast. So you'll have to check it out.
I'm looking forward to that pod. Again, Inside the Birds podcast dropping tomorrow morning. Great stuff today, Geoff.
All right, Josh. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.